They told North American Aviation they had 120 days to design a new fighter from scratch. The British were desperate. The Luftwaffe was winning, and America wasn't even in the war yet. Most companies would have said it was impossible. North American said yes. What came out of that deadline was an aircraft that looked like it could rewrite history. But for 2 years, nobody wanted it. This is the story of the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that almost failed before it changed everything. In early 1940, Britain was bleeding aircraft faster than factories could replace them. The RAF approached North American Aviation, a company that had never built a modern high-performance fighter, and asked them to manufacture the Curtiss P-40. The president, James Kindleberger, made a counter-offer that sounded insane. His team could design something better in the same time it would take to set up P-40 production. The British were desperate enough to gamble. They gave him 4 months. Lead designer Edgar Schmood worked around the clock with a small team of engineers who knew they were designing an aircraft for a war their own country wasn't fighting yet. They borrowed ideas ruthlessly. Laminar flow wings from NACA research, radiator placement that turned drag into thrust, cockpit visibility better than anything in the sky. In October 1940, 117 days after signing the contract, the prototype rolled out. It looked fast sitting still. Test pilots loved it. The RAF ordered it in huge numbers. Then they flew it in combat and everything fell apart. The Mustang had the body of a champion, but its heart was killing it. The early Mustangs used the Allison-powered 710 engine, and below 15,000 feet they were phenomenal, fast, agile, deadly. But the air war over Europe was being fought at 25,000 feet and higher. Up there, the Allison choked. It lost power. German fighters dove from 30,000 feet, and Mustang pilots could only watch them come. The RAF pushed their Mustangs into low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The aircraft everyone thought would change the air war became a sideshow. The engineers knew what the problem was. They just didn't know how to fix it without starting over. Then, in 1942, an RAF and Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker flew a Mustang and saw something nobody else had really seen. He wrote a 5-page report built around one simple idea: marry the American airframe to the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin was the engine that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes. It had a 2-stage supercharger that kept feeding compressed air to the cylinders even when other engines were gasping. Packard was already building Merlins under license in America. The first test flights in late 1942 produced results that seemed almost too good to be real. The Mustang's top speed jumped from about 360 miles per hour to roughly 440. Service ceiling went from around 30,000 feet to 41,000. Suddenly the aircraft nobody had wanted could outfly anything the Luftwaffe had. But there was a catch. The first Merlin Mustangs, the P-51B models, had a problem that was getting pilots killed. The engine produced so much power that in high-speed dives the aircraft would roll uncontrollably. Pilots called it the snap roll, and it happened without warning. You'd be lining up a shot, diving on a German fighter, and suddenly your aircraft would flip and you'd be tumbling toward the ground with no control. Some men died before engineers figured out how to tame it with a small dorsal fin added to the tail. The Mustang had finally found its power, but it still had to earn its reputation the hard way. In early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign was a bloodbath. American B-17 and B-24 bombers flew into Germany in daylight, and the Luftwaffe tore them apart. The problem was simple and brutal. No Allied fighter had the range to escort bombers deep into the Third Reich. Thunderbolts and Lightnings could follow them part way, but then they had to turn back. After that, bomber crews were alone, and German fighters were waiting. Mission after mission returned with horrific losses. Entire squadrons wiped out. On some raids, 1 in 4 bombers didn't come home. Something had to change, or the entire strategy would collapse. The Mustang was about to solve a problem most people didn't think had a solution. Its designers had made it ruthlessly aerodynamically efficient. The laminar flow wing reduced drag. The radiator scoop beneath the fuselage created a small amount of forward thrust as hot air exited the rear. Every bit of efficiency meant less fuel burned per mile. With internal tanks and 2 external drop tanks, the P-51D could fly more than 1,500 miles. That meant taking off from England, escorting bombers to Berlin, fighting over the target and still making it home. No other fighter in the world could do that. When the first Mustang-escorted missions reached deep inside Germany in early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. American fighters weren't supposed to be there. For years they had owned the German interior. They could form up safely, attack the bombers at will, land, rearm, and do it again. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. But the Mustang didn't just change where battles happened. It changed how they happened. And that's where things became personal for the men who flew them. The P-51D carried 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. In a 2-second burst, a pilot could send about 160 rounds downrange. 50 caliber rounds were devastating. They could punch through engine blocks, shred control surfaces, ignite fuel tanks. But the guns were only as good as the pilot behind them, and American pilots were being trained for a new kind of warfare. The old rules said, stay close to the bombers no matter what. Then, in early 1944, Major General William Kepner changed everything. He told fighter pilots they were no longer just escorts, they were hunters. If you saw a German airfield, you strafed it. If you saw enemy fighters forming up, you broke off and hit them before they reached the bombers. The Mustang finally had the range and speed to be both guardian and predator. The tactical doctrine was built around energy management. Keep your speed. Keep your altitude. Dive on the enemy. Take your shot. Use that speed to climb back up and reset. German pilots called it boom and zoom, and against the Bf-109S and FW-19OS it was brutally effective. But there was a cost almost nobody talked about. The new aggressive tactics were getting inexperienced pilots killed. Young flyers would see a German fighter, dive after it in excitement, chase it down to the deck, and get bounced by another enemy they never saw. Or they'd strafe an airfield and fly straight into flak they couldn't avoid. The Mustang gave you every advantage, but it couldn't protect you from your own mistakes. The veterans, the ones who survived long enough to learn, understood something crucial. The job wasn't to rack up kills. The job was to bring yourself and your wingman home while keeping the bombers safe. Some men learned that lesson. Others didn't live long enough, and one man who learned it better than almost anyone was about to prove that even the best could run out of luck. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe belonged to the Mustang. Luftwaffe pilots who had ruled the air for years were now being hunted in their own airspace. German fighters were lost on the ground, lost in the climb, and lost over their own bases. The strategic balance had flipped so completely that veteran German pilots later said the arrival of Mustangs over Berlin was the moment they knew the war was over. Not because the aircraft was unbeatable in a dogfight, though it often was, but because it meant nowhere was safe anymore. The deep war had come home. Bomber losses fell. Allied air superiority became total. But every mission, every kill, every safe return required a man in a cockpit to make it happen, and those men didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as doing a job. One of them was better at that job than almost anyone else, and his story shows what the Mustang meant to the men who flew it. George Preddy grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. He wasn't the kind of kid people expected to become a fighter ace. Quiet, methodical, good with his hands. Before the war, he worked in his father's business and imagined an ordinary future. Then Pearl Harbor happened. He enlisted, trained as a pilot, and by late 1943 he was in England with the 352nd Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt was tough and powerful, but Preddy never felt fully at home in it. It was heavy, sluggish in turns, more like a flying tank than a fighter. In early 1944, his squadron transitioned to the P-51 Mustang. The first time Preddy flew it, everything clicked. The Mustang responded to his touch like it was reading his mind, lighter, faster, more alive than the Thunderbolt. He later told squadron mates it felt like the difference between driving a truck and driving a sports car. Both would get you there, but one made you feel like part of the machine. That connection mattered. because what came next would test him in ways training never could. Preddy started scoring kills, but not through recklessness. He had a gift for deflection shooting, the ability to calculate where an enemy would be and fire into empty air, letting the target fly into his bullets. It's one of the hardest skills in air combat, and Preddy made it look effortless. His squadron mates noticed something else. He didn't get rattled. In fights where other pilots panicked or got tunnel vision, Preddy stayed calm, made decisions, kept his head moving. By the summer of 1944, he had become one of the most effective pilots in 8th Air Force. Then came August 6th, 1944, and a mission that would make him a legend. His squadron was escorting bombers near Berlin when they intercepted a large formation of German fighters. What happened next still doesn't seem real. In the chaos of that single engagement, Preddy shot down 6 enemy aircraft. 6 confirmed kills in one mission made him one of the top American aces in the European theater overnight. But if you read what he wrote about it in letters home, there's no excitement, no celebration. He described it in technical terms: altitude, deflection angles, ammunition expenditure. He didn't talk about fear, but every pilot felt it. The knowledge that a single mistake, a moment of distraction, a lucky burst from an enemy, could end everything in an instant. The Mustang gave him the tools, but survival was never guaranteed. What Preddy understood, and what separated him from pilots who didn't make it, was that the real job wasn't getting kills. It was bringing yourself and your wingman home. In a profession where aggression was often confused with courage, he knew that calculated patience kept you alive. By December 1944, he had 26 confirmed aerial victories. The war finally felt like it might actually end soon. That's when the worst thing that could happen happened, and it had nothing to do with the Luftwaffe. December 25th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was raging, and the Germans had launched a massive surprise offensive. Allied positions were under severe pressure, and the weather had been too bad for air support for days. When the skies finally cleared on Christmas morning, every available fighter went up. Preddy's flight intercepted German aircraft near Liège, Belgium. He shot down 2 Bf-10-9s quickly, then spotted a third trying to escape. He went after it. In combat, you develop tunnel vision. The target becomes everything. Preddy chased the German fighter low, below 1,000 feet, completely focused on the kill. What he didn't see, what he couldn't have known, was that he had crossed into an area where American anti-aircraft units were on high alert. They had been hit hard during the Bulge. They were jumpy, exhausted, and expecting German ground attack aircraft at any moment. They saw a fighter flying fast and low. In the chaos of combat, in the split second they had to make a decision, they didn't wait to confirm identification. They opened fire. George Preddy was killed by friendly fire. He was 25 years old. When his squadron got the news, some of them couldn't process it. Preddy had survived more than 100 combat missions. He had outflown and outfought some of the best pilots Germany had. He had mastered the Mustang, understood air combat better than almost anyone, and made it look easy. And in the end, it wasn't enemy skill or mechanical failure or bad luck in a dogfight that killed him. It was a mistake. The American gunners who shot him down didn't know. They were doing their job, trying to protect their unit from what they thought was an enemy attack. Nobody was really at fault, and yet a man who had done everything right was dead. That's the thing about war that nobody tells you. Skill and courage, and the best aircraft in the world can protect you from everything. And the men who flew Mustangs knew that every single time they climbed into the cockpit. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Allied fighters, led by the P-51 Mustang, had achieved total air superiority over Europe. German pilots who had once controlled the sky were grounded by fuel shortages, losses they couldn't replace, and the constant threat of being bounced by American fighters at any altitude. The strategic bombing campaign that had cost so many lives in 1943 now ran with losses that commanders could accept. Bomber crews still faced flak and the occasional desperate German interceptor, but the mass slaughter was over. The Mustang was one of the keys to that change. It didn't win the war alone. No weapon ever does. But it altered the equation in a way nothing else could. It gave Allied bombers the protection they needed to reach any target in the Third Reich. It forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive war of attrition they couldn't win. And it proved that engineering decisions made in a California hangar could help shift the course of history. Edgar Schmood and his design team never flew combat missions. They never faced the Luftwaffe at 30,000 feet. But every time a bomber crew made it home because a Mustang was there, Schmood's decisions mattered. Every time a young pilot climbed into that cockpit and felt the aircraft respond to his touch, the work of engineers who had stayed up late refining a radiator scoop or adjusting a wing profile made the difference between life and death. The P-51 Mustang wasn't the fastest aircraft of the war. It wasn't the most heavily armed. It didn't have the mystique of the Spitfire or the raw toughness of the Thunderbolt. What it had was range, reliability, and the ability to be exactly where it was needed when it mattered most. The men who flew it weren't superhuman. They were young Americans who trained hard, followed orders, watched out for their wingmen, and tried to make it home. Some did, some didn't. The difference often came down to inches, seconds, and the performance of the machine they trusted with their lives. In the end, the Mustang's legacy isn't just in kill counts or mission records. It's in the thousands of bomber crewmen who came home because someone in a silver fighter was watching their backs. It's in the quiet understanding that wars are won by people who do their jobs well, even when nobody is watching. If stories like this matter to you, stay with us. There are more to tell.